I think that there was a feeling in around 2011, 12, 13, prior to the Snowden revelations, that the protections around digital technologies in the West, for want of a better word, were kind of miles ahead of those in the developing world. And I think particularly with the Arab Spring and the way we saw surveillance technologies being used by Tunisia, Libya and Egypt during that period, I think there was a very strong sense in the EU at least that this was an illustration of how a lack of legal regulation, strong judicial oversight, etc., in the developing world had led to these really strong, really outrageous oversteps when it comes to surveillance. And then, of course, only 1 year later, we saw the reality of what is happening in the West is matching, the type of surveillance happening in those countries. I don't think you can underestimate the power that the kind of counter-terrorism debate has on the surveillance debate and how closely enmeshed those two are. And to come to France, I think you've really seen that in the last 2 years. France had a long history, like the UK, of very secretive intelligence work. Their intelligence agencies were not regulated by public legislation at all. Okay. And then it wasn't the Snowden revelations, but the Paris attacks, which catalyzed the development of the law around intelligence in France. And really the leaping forward to far greater and more intrusive powers. The legislation they've passed in the last 2 years is, just as frightening as the investigatory powers bill. And there you've seen really just how strong a motivator terrorism really is in trying to expand state surveillance powers. In France, for example, one of the provisions that is in their legislation now is the installation of black boxes on internet cables, right, which can be used to filter out or filter in order to identify terrorist content. Now, we don't really know what that means, whether or not they're kind of putting a list of words that include bomb and I don't know, kill, and then they're filtering, everybody's Google searches on the basis of those words.
But how would that relate to statements that we've had in this country that extremists are going to be sort of monitored through Google kind of speech mechanisms?
Right.
I mean, that puts us in the same category, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, I would say that the French narrative is adopted just as quickly by the British politicians to justify extension of British surveillance. And this is really why this issue is quite a complex one, because we are at a point in which the threat of terrorism, while in my opinion continues to be overstated, has a unique structure. The terrorist threat currently being kind of decentralized, being homegrown, I suppose. I don't know a better word to describe that, but rather than it being in a foreign country, trying to identify burgeoning terrorist threats within one's country. I think that's part of the nature. Being digital in the sense that there's a range of tools available for communication, yes, and for acquisition of materials now that there weren't even 10, 15 years ago.
It's the perfect provocation, really.
Yeah, so I think it's a unique posture, the terrorist threat at the moment. It's in a unique place that positions it so that the answer from the security services point of view is more surveillance. At the moment, I think it's a perfect storm for the British politicians to be able to point to the nature of the Brussels attack or the Paris attacks and to say the precise thing we need to counter this is greater monitoring of text messages, or the ability to break encryption because they're using encrypted text messaging services. It provides the perfect question to which they have the answer. And so I think that's a really unique and complex part of the debate at the moment. And I think there are definitely ways, to demonstrate that is not the answer.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it, that some of the foremost sort of whistleblowers who were formerly working at the NSA have such a concerted line that the sheer amount of data, yes, being mined prevents you from actually, right, being efficient in, yes, the pursuit of terrorists. And then if in fact it is old-fashioned, really good undercover policing that is decisive in these.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point that I've heard a number of ex-police officers and others in law enforcement raise, which is that in the past 10 years, their budget has decreased
yes.
for human intelligence and investigatory policing,
yes.
while the budget for digital surveillance has increased. And I think your point is exactly right, that things like the Brussels and Paris attacks and even Woolwich serve to illustrate that perhaps we've done ourselves a disservice by investing so much in digital surveillance, even from a utilitarian perspective, because police forces aren't able to do that type of policing, which actually could have been decisive.
So let's move on now to what's going to happen next. What do you think are the key turning points, either in Britain or internationally? And what shape are the forces in that are trying to defend our human rights on the internet?
Okay, well, I'd say one of the ways I'd cut it is to look at law and technology. In terms of the law, I think we have some real challenges ahead. We have new surveillance laws in countries like Britain, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, potentially Finland, Denmark, France just recently, which really seek to expand existing powers that are on the books and not necessarily expand protections. So I think we have a European trend towards legitimizing greater surveillance in the law. At the same time, and interestingly, we have a European trend towards stronger privacy regulation, particularly in the General Data Protection Regulation, which was adopted early this year and which will come into force in 2017. And there we see a pretty strong commitment to improving privacy protections for consumers and individuals. So I think if we compare those two trends, greater surveillance powers amongst European states, but also stronger privacy protections, we can see this exceptionalism for national security and law enforcement, but a real desire to protect privacy vis-a-vis companies and consumer issues.
Okay.
So I think that's an interesting contrast. I think you can probably cut that in a range of different ways around European attitudes and different political interests pushing up against each other. But one way is to look at it that national security issues will continue to be an exceptionalist area of policy that allows for these powers to expand. I think the trends in Europe around surveillance are going to continue to be mimicked and followed by countries outside of Europe. Mm-hmm. One of the means by which that happens is through the use of cybercrime legislation to increase surveillance powers. So I think an interesting development in the law camp is as cyber issues become more and more relevant and part of the public consciousness, we see cybercrime and cybersecurity as broad policy justifications that are being rolled out to kind of justify a range of different things. The public is much more in tune to what cyber threats are, to how cybersecurity might be relevant to them in a very real day-to-day sense. And I think that there's a tendency to use that to kind of roll out a range of different powers. And one of the ways we see that in developing countries is the adoption of cybercrime legislation, which is in fact surveillance legislation, or even legislation which restricts certain speech online. Okay. So for example, in a number of countries in the Middle East, the cybercrime legislation will contain restrictions on whether or not you can criticize the government on the internet, for example. So that's a really interesting area of law and policy that's also difficult because cybercrime is a real threat. Cybersecurity is an important policy driver, and countries are very integrated in their concerns in that regard. It's very hard for the UK to protect its cybersecurity without working with other countries around the world on cybersecurity issues. So there's a really strong global driver for greater cybersecurity policy and law, but at the same time, I think that's being used by some countries as a shield for them to expand their own surveillance and intrusions into online speech, basically.
Can we just linger a bit on this online speech? Because we were talking earlier about the statement that if you criticize the government or mainstream media, you could be monitored for extremism. Do you think this area of speech is going to be an international front line that we'll have to push back on, or do you think it will be particularly acute in places like Egypt?
I think, the idea of kind of countering online extremism is becoming a very popular way to describe a number of different policy initiatives, and I think we've seen here in the UK the way that the term extremism can be used.
You said that you were worried about the homogenization of culture within that
absolutely, yeah, absolutely, because I think that this idea that extremist speech is radical speech, and that radical speech is speech which counters mainstream ideas, which we almost see verbatim in UK policy documents. I mean, they don't put it that plainly, but the materials given to the children, to parents of children in schools, trying to educate parents about what it looks like if your child is displaying extremist tendencies, include, as an example, that they disagree with mainstream media, that they show disapproval of mainstream political ideologies, etc. And I do think that what underpins that is a rejection of radical ideas and radical thinking, and that concerns me. That's where I feel that what in fact we're promoting is a homogenized cultural attitudes and political attitudes, etc. I don't think that necessarily is the same concern that exists in countries like Egypt, actually. I think that in the US and the UK, we see really this countering violent extremism narrative very strongly. I'm a lawyer. I've always been very much of the position that law is the tool that we need to use to protect digital rights and to solve these very complex issues. But I'm increasingly of the opinion that technology can provide some of the solutions that we're after. And particularly when it comes to encryption and how encryption interacts with privacy and data protection. And we've seen in the last year or two, that be really at the forefront of current affairs and political debate, particularly with the Apple and FBI encryption scandal, I guess you'd call it. And I think we've seen a number of companies really stepping up to extend the encryption that they offer in a way that provides really tangible gains in terms of privacy and digital rights. So a company like WhatsApp that, I think hundreds of millions of people use around the world has now provided end-to-end encryption, which means that people, governments, cyber criminals cannot intercept your text messages. I think that's a really tangible advancement that's shoring up digital rights around the world. So I think that I think it is at risk. There is a policy debate going on around encryption, but I think that at the end of the day that will kind of triumph, and that we'll see greater rollout of encryption in a way that becomes more of a standard part of our interaction with the internet and our interaction with technologies, and starts to destabilize some of the even more, the more pernicious surveillance apparatuses out there. I think that they will become less effective as technology provides the answers to privacy problems.
And is technology being better at articulating itself in ways that lawyers and general publics might understand?
I think that remains a challenge. I think, but again, the fact that they've now included coding in the curriculum from the age of 5, I think that's an amazing advancement. That's
terrifying.
It is terrifying. I agree. I think that's long term. I think that's going to make all the difference. That having ordinary people be much more conversant with technology will give people much more agency over how they use technology and where their data goes. And I think in the long term, that will really breed a new ideology around freedom of speech and privacy on the internet, which will allow people to control their data, control their own experiences online. For such a long time, we were really helpless in the hands of Google and Facebook. And I don't think that that's the future. I think we're becoming more empowered to make choices